Wallis had no birth certificate, nor was there a newspaper announcement of her birth, although it probably took place on June 19, 1896. She was born in a cottage at a fashionable resort that happened to sprawl across the meeting of 4 counties, 2 in Maryland, 2 in Pennsylvania, such that she literally came into the world on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line. Wallis's parents both came from distinguished families, and both had supported the Confederacy, but neither family approved of their marriage. Her mother's Warfields looked down on her father's Montagues, who they believed to be below them. Wallis's father died 5 months after she was born. She grew up in Baltimore, with her mother always dependent on the Warfield fortune, which was meted out in small, irregular amounts by Wallis's controlling Uncle Sol. She went to the most prestigious preparatory school in Maryland, Oldfields, where she got a reputation for smoking, sneaking out, and having boyfriends. While she displayed a strong and outgoing personality that made her magnetic to some of the girls, in particular her best friend, Mary Kirk. That same disposition offended most adults, including Mary's family. Just after graduation, Wallis went to live in Pensacola, Florida, with her cousin Corinne, whose husband, a U.S. Navy captain, had just been appointed head of the then-new Pensacola Air Base. This sort of excitement suited Wallis, and she almost immediately fell in love with an officer at the base, Lieutenant Earl Winfield Spencer, known as Win, and married him. There are several theories related to the possible sexual abnormalities that may have contributed to the ways in which Wallis approached others and the choices she made in her life. Among these theories, the most dependable seems to be the one that originated from her biographer, Michael Bloch, who lived in her house in Paris while she was still alive and consulted with her doctors. Bloch thought she may have androgen insensitivity syndrome, which means she would have been born with an XY chromosome, genetically male, but with receptors that were insensitive to testosterone, so that she developed as female. People who have this condition are considered female by doctors, but they do not have ovaries or a uterus, and therefore cannot have children. If true, the condition may have contributed to the development of her angular features, and Wallis's lifelong obsession with being thin, lest it become obvious she didn't have a waistline, and of course, that through 3 marriages she never had children. According to one biographer, she told her good friend Herman Rogers, who gave her away at her wedding to the Duke of Windsor, that she had never had sex with her first 2 husbands, nor had anyone been allowed to touch her below her personal Mason-Dixon line. Nevertheless, Wallis was a talented and notorious flirt, lit up by men in a way she never was with women, so much so that Win Spencer's sister said of her, she could no more keep from flirting than breathing. Because Win was in the military, the couple moved frequently. He drank heavily and was at times abusive, and it's likely that Wallis's flirting and failure to produce children, or perhaps have a sexual relationship of any kind, contributed to the disintegration of their marriage. But Wallis dropped the idea of pursuing a legal divorce when Win was posted to China. When Win wrote and asked Wallis to come to China to try to make the marriage work again, she went, and in 1924, she arrived in Hong Kong. Things didn't work out with Win, but Wallis didn't go home. She went to Shanghai. Wallis called this period in her life, single and in China, her Lotus Year, where she perfected the social skills she would depend upon for the rest of her life, using sometimes distant contacts to go where she wanted and to obtain access to the most fashionable parties. In Shanghai, she lived for a time with a man whose exact identity remains a mystery, and later moved to what was then known as Peking, now Beijing. There, attending a party with a man who was a friend of her cousin, she ran into an old friend, Catherine Rogers, who was living in China with her husband Herman. Wallis went to their house for lunch the next day, and subsequently moved in. The Lotus Year ended fairly bleakly, when Wallis, nearing 30, thought it was time she go home and get married. Wallis became extremely ill on the boat back to the United States, and on arrival had to be taken to a Seattle hospital for surgery. The source of her ailment, or the stomach attacks she had throughout her life, was never clear, with theories ranging from Win's abuse to a botched abortion to complications of the androgen insensitivity syndrome she may have had. Once she recovered, and was legally divorced from Wynne. Wallis was, as usual, dependent on the kindness of friends in New York. During this period, she was theoretically trying to find a job, but she continually failed, sometimes as a result of her own tastes and sense of her own elevated social standing. An attempt at a secretarial course failed because she did not take to typewriters. At the time, though, Wallis asserted that she wanted to do something different, something out of the ordinary for woman, a job in which she could pitch my wits not against other women, but against men in a man's world, which is the enormous irony of her life. Wallis did do a number of things that were very out of the ordinary for women of her time, and did go up against a man's world. But she never did so by taking a job, and often did so by pitting herself against women. The man she finally chose to marry was Ernest Simpson, whom she had met in New York through her childhood friend Mary Kirky. Simpson was already married, but became taken with Wallis and asked her if she would marry him once they were both out of their marriages. She agreed. Simpson was not that rich, nor was he particularly glamorous, and her decision to marry him, as well as her continuing affection for him after they were married, suggests that, though concerned with social status, Wallis was most interested in security. Ernest fit the bill. He was good-looking, bookish in a way that implied good breeding, and, what did turn out to be his greatest appeal, dependable. Ernest was half British, and once married, the couple moved to London for a new start. Wallis had always curated her life, and once she and Ernest found a permanent home in which she could entertain, she set about collecting an interesting array of guests, inevitably with a strong American nucleus. Those whom she invited for dinner were drawn almost entirely from her carefully nurtured contacts. Chief among these was Benjamin Thaw, newly appointed First Secretary of the U.S. Embassy, married to Consuelo, one of the trio of glamorous Morgan sisters who had exotic Spanish looks and lots of money. She also knew of, although she had not met, Consuelo's twin sisters Thelma Furness and Gloria Vanderbilt, both celebrated society beauties. Thelma was currently the much-gossiped-about lover of the Prince of Wales, and Wallis knew that the pair sometimes met at the Thaws' home. This was all before Wallis got involved with the British entitled noble classes. Wallis was openly interested in meeting Edward, the Prince of Wales, from the moment she moved to London, and in 1931 she did, through her friend Thelma Furness, who was herself having an affair with the prince, though she was married. To keep up some appearance of innocence, Furness needed a married couple for cover, to chaperone a gang for a weekend at Thelma's home in Leicestershire with the prince. This weekend is where Wallis first met Edward. There are not many details for this weekend, but the two met again at a later cocktail party Furness also hosted, and then again when Wallis and Ernest were presented to the court. It's not totally clear how Wallis went from there to entertaining the prince at a dinner party at her home in 1932, but she did, and she and Ernest were then invited to spend a weekend at the fort. They went on to spend many weekends there, which Ernest enjoyed at least in the beginning, although as time went by it was clear that Thelma was inviting the pair for Wallis's benefit, as the prince had fallen for her sharp tongue and risqué repartee. There was a deeper psychosexual dynamic between the two. Observers noted that Wallis frequently humiliated or emasculated the prince by such things as taking over the carving of a chicken by seizing the knife from his hand, or having him call her a taxi instead of one of his abundant staff. When they were alone, without guests at the fort, Wallis was noted by staff members to taunt and berate him until he was reduced to tears. He then overcompensated to please her. The first time it seemed as if the prince might have truly singled Wallis out as a real object of affection was on the eve of a trip she was taking to the United States. She received a radiogram from him fondly wishing her goodbye and a safe journey. Nonetheless, at this stage, Wallis believed it was evidence of no more than a mild interest, though perhaps something to make Thelma jealous, and that she had the situation well under control. When Thelma left for an extended stateside trip, and the prince was suddenly without a mistress, he put the full weight of his admiration on Wallis. He came by her house to see her nearly every day, came for dinner several times a week, phoned 2 or 3 times a day, and she was expected at the fort on weekends and whenever else she could make time. Ernest hadn't raised any formal objections. "At the moment he's flattered with it all," Wallis wrote her aunt. But she admitted, with a touch of anxiety, that keeping up with two men is making me move all the time. In the summer of 1934, Wallis went, without Ernest, on a vacation with the prince. They were not entirely alone, of course. Princes tend to travel with an entourage. Wallis's Aunt Bessie went with them to Biarritz, and the Rogerses went with them when the whole group went cruising on a friend's boat, but Wallis later wrote of the trip. "Perhaps it was during those evenings off the Spanish coast that we crossed the line that marks the indefinable boundary between friendship and love." The royal opinion can be summed up the report from Honor John Aird, who was along for the vacation as a staff member, and who was offended by Wallis's brash behavior and by the prince's apparent adoration for it. By the end of it, Aird wrote, "The prince had lost all confidence in himself and follows Wallis around like a dog. After the trip, the prince insisted on presenting Wallis before the king and queen, reportedly began paying Wallis an income, and at the same time began gifting her an ever-expanding collection of jewelry, a topic of much gossip in London. It becomes a matter of interpretation at this point as to who was pulling what strings. The old guard disapproved and abhorred the idea of Wallis as queen. The newer guard found the idea exciting because it meant there was a way for nearly anyone, into the royal family. The royal family itself wanted her gone, and of course commissioned an investigation. But then, in the investigation, it came out that Ernest himself was fine with the whole arrangement, because he expected the prince to become king soon, at which point he imagined he would have his wife back and be awarded high honors. After the death of his father, the prince became Edward VIII, and immediately horrified the royal staff by insisting that he stand next to Wallis at the ceremony of his own proclamation by the Garter King of Arms. He barely read the papers, took 5-day weekends with Wallis at the fort, and when in London shut himself in with her. He became more and more attached. Meanwhile, civil war broke out in Spain, and Hitler violated the Treaty of Versailles for the first time as he continued to militarize Germany. The king was, during all of these events, mainly concerned with finding a way to make Wallis his queen, facing the vehement opposition of his family and the fact that Wallis was still married to another man. Wallis eventually took a trip to Paris with a friend to escape him, in part because she hated the pressure on her, with the king constantly telephoning her, relying on her. She felt she was losing control of the situation and wanted to get Ernest back as her husband. One night in February, Ernest and his friend Bernard Ricketson Hatt, the editor-in-chief of Reuters, were at dinner with the king when Ernest finally asked him if he intended to marry her. The king apparently stood up and said, "Do you really think I would be crowned without Wallis at my side?" He and Ernest then reached what an accommodation, that Ernest would let go of Wallis if the king would agree to take care of her. When Edward told his secretaries and his mother that, after much thought, he had decided to abdicate and marry Wallis, they remonstrated with the him, calling up the obvious argument of duty and responsibility. His answer was, "The only thing that matters is our happiness." Wallis was enamored primarily with the prince's lifestyle. Ernest's business suffered after the crash of 1929, so what had always been his advantage, security, wasn't what it had once been, but not necessarily of him. That she did not ever want to be queen, that she always assumed his infatuation would pass, that she always intended to end up with Ernest, and that, essentially, events spiraled out of her control. Wallis wrote to Ernest in summer of 1935. She happened to be at the prince's place in Cannes, where Ernest could not have gone even if he was invited, and letters she wrote to her Aunt Bessie in the fall of the same year, when he, Ernest, went on a business trip, of how much she missed the saintly Ernest. Later, even after the prince had told Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin and his own mother, at a meeting, of his intention to abdicate the throne, and told Wallis to flee to Cannes, the letters she wrote to Ernest were filled with regret, and even after she was divorced and remarried to Edward, she wrote to Ernest tenderly, and referred to him as Peter Pan, a nickname that didn't exactly indicate hopeless love so much as deep tenderness. Even if such communications were done with posterity, and her historical reputation as a kind-hearted character in mind, or simply to make Ernest feel better about the whole thing, there's still not much convincing evidence that Wallis wanted either to be queen or for Edward to abdicate. She well knew that, set afloat in the world, they would end up dependent on others, less sought out by powerful people and concerned about money, all the things she'd tried her whole life to avoid. There were other options, of course. That Edward keep Wallis as a formal mistress without the entanglements of marriage, that he marry her and she be given a title, and title lower than that of queen. Wallis and her Aunt Bessie did make cases for just these options, but the king stubbornly refused, and thus Wallis knew the only thing he could do was abdicate. Historians have suggested that there was a real chance the two could have been reconciled with the royal family, and even moved back to England, if Edward would allow Wallis to be recognized only as the Duchess of Windsor, but he would have a queen or nothing. The way that things worked out could not have been what Wallis ever wanted for her life or her relationship with Edward. She became the focal point of massive collective ill will. She received piles of hate mail, and was so hounded by newspapers and shunned by former friends in London that she could barely leave the house and eventually fled the country, at one point in her escape being forced to hide under a blanket in the back of the car. A wedding should, theoretically, come near the beginning of a love story, but for the Windsors, at least from the outside, it was the end of theirs. Wallis had gotten to the very top of her era's social world and gotten her hands on a few strings, only to lose her grip and end up in a situation she could only attempt to endure. Other than the iconic dress Wallis wore, and the clement weather, the event of the wedding itself, which took place in the Loire Valley home of French-born American industrialist Charles Badeau, was dismal, with few friends and no royals attending. The one eccentric royal chaplain who would perform the service, the Reverend R. Anderson Jardine, was ostracized when he returned to England and moved to America shortly after. Once married, the couple did some traveling, including a trip to Germany, where Wallis was photographed meeting Hitler, a connection that would only further doom the couple to infamy at home. During World War II, Edward was appointed the governor of the Bahamas, a position most people, Wallis included, generally considered a punishment. Their lives were defined by each other, the past, and aesthetics. Decorating, shopping, holding formal dinners, being noticed by the newspapers.
They were bitter toward the royal family, and Wallis was eternally frustrated that she no longer held the interest of people at high levels of society, government, or the arts. Her wit grew sharper and meaner. They wrote their separate memoirs, they ate next to nothing, and they drank a lot. Nothing else in his life gave Edward any sense of achievement other than his marriage to Wallis. For her, the slavish devotion was at times claustrophobic, and she was not afraid to show it. But love is impossible to define, and in their case especially so. Few who knew them well described what they shared as love.